Hi, and welcome to my presentation it's a literature review on feminist peace. I'll be looking at how feminist scholarship is actually quite different, how like academia in itself um, varies from a quite passive to a quite active way of looking at women and looking at their agency within peace studies. In general, like there's been decades of feminist scholarship that have portrayed how war, intense conflict is gendered in its origins, in its immediate consequences and future implications. However, what I have seen quite a lot, which I think a lot of people agree upon, is that women are often thought of as victims when their roles and their positionalities are analyzed in academia. And what I want this literature review to show is that in reality, well, at least from a personal perspective, we need to look at women as agents with power, with agency, and with independence in society. Um, so, just to like make quick overview, in general, like I will be approaching this for like an IR lens, and in international relations, when we think of feminist or like gendered peace, as you can see, we look at the structural conditions. That is to say that like we think of Johan Galtung's positive peace, and we think of the absence of structural violence. However, often what I have found academia to do is to focus only upon the structural violence in itself and forget about how the interplay is between direct, structural, and cultural violence. So, using Galtung's conflict triangle, we can see how the attitudes and assumptions in society and the contradictions in society, that is to say, like for example, like in the case of gender, like how like sexism as well as like the like direct inequality in society play into the violence, for example, like sexual violence or like gendered violence and like discriminatory acts that women face. What I want to show in this presentation is that there are various approaches to how the position of women in peace building and in conflict zones are analyzed, um, where often the stress is placed upon gender equality, but it's often quite problematic because it assumes difference between the sexes when instead, like I would argue, that it should further engage with the like discursive mechanisms through which difference and inequality are produced. For example, when we look at works such as like Bananas, Beaches, and Bases, or the work of Jenna Sapiano, which with the title I wouldn't want to be a gender expert, um, these, this journal and this book often look at like only like at the suffering of women, that is to say like what is their position, like for example in Banana Speeches and Bases, how like they were the wives of like men in the military, how they were the victims of sexual violence, how it's always like putting like women in focus, but in a way in which they are only seen as not having certain agency. Um, Whereas I would say, what I would argue, that instead our focus should shift upon men. It should shift upon masculinities. It should shift upon militarism and the interplay between the patriarchy and militarism and how conflict is conducted. Uh, which is why I personally found it very interesting to read Claire Duncanson's Gender in Peace Building, as well as looking into Oxfam's collection of essays from women from the MENA region, from the Pacific, and from sub-Saharan Africa, who write about their experiences within conflict zones and how they themselves have empowered themselves and how they have contributed to peace building processes. And actually, Oxfam's um, like collection of essays was a response to um, analysis of like a major peace process from 1992 to 2018, showing that women constituted only 13% of negotiators and 3% of mediators. But in great contrast to using these statistics only to almost victimize women, as done in the previous work I just showed you. Um, what I believe that Oxfam does so greatly is that they give this power, this agency to the women and to tell their own stories. And of course, there needs to be structural change. But as Duncanson underscores, women conflict zones also facilitate and negotiate peace constantly. Like they are actively concerned with negotiations of survival, with warfare, with security, and with different stakeholders. And it's important to understand that although women might not always, and that's something that needs to change, but women might not always be in positions of which they structurally have as much power as men. It's important to understand that that does not make them victims necessarily. They often, a lot of women have empowered themselves and have done a lot to contribute to the peace in certain regions. And instead of focusing only on the personality of the woman, these two bodies of work call for looking at the bridge between the patriarchy and the positionality of the women instead of only focusing on the women isolatedly, which I think is exemplified quite clearly in the work of Hugh Kinsella. So basically, like using this, let's call it the case study of this female group under the leadership of Liberata Buradwa in Congo, DR Congo, we see how these women, although structurally being defined as inferior to the men, both in rebel groups, in the government, and in different armed groups to the country, they are active peacemakers. They are the ones that actually use their gender to empower themselves in these situations when they go to the rebel groups to argue for larger security, to complain about acts of sexual violence, to facilitate communication. They present themselves as mothers, they present themselves as daughters, they present themselves as wives to these people. Um, and in that way, it just shows how, like, being a woman should not be connected to this inferiority. And I think that part of dismantling this overall structural violence that we are faced with in society, this structural violence that women not only face but also condemned to always face, I think that needs to be dismantled by looking at the cultural violence in society. That's to say, what narratives do we use when we conduct peace studies? When we do academia, how do we understand women and their positionality? Do we understand them as from a synchronic perspective, looking at like, oh, women will always be in this position, and that's wrong? Or do we look at what have women done? What can women do? Where do we want to get women? So this kind of like more like active way to approaching women and peace studies and feminist peace, making me arrive to the conclusion that effective feminist peace building must encounter not only the gendered impacts of war, but also the gendered experiences of war and the gendered drivers of war, if we want to see an effective change in the structural violence that women face around the globe, and an effective change in how feminist peace studies are conducted and how feminist peace is established and engaged with in conflict.